Hello, welcome. Today we study ideologies of the Second World War. This clash between the Third Reich and the USSR, Germany, the lands of Greater Germany, and Russia was an arms race. It was an arms race, and it was a race for steel and armaments, tank, heavy gun, cannon, artillery, and soldiers fighting the front lines. It was a race. I believe that Hitler invaded the Soviet Union just as the Soviet Union was going on an up curve of its capability. You see, Hitler invaded right at this tangent point when the Soviet Union was upswinging to become a titan and a world superpower. So that every month that passed after Operation Barbarossa was launched, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion that Germany launched against the Soviet Union, was launched on June 22nd, 1941 at 3 o'clock in the morning, when all hell broke loose, and as Hitler said, the world would hold its breath. But the Germans were invading the Russians as Russians were finally on an upswing of capability. The Russians had 14 million men reserved for the Soviet military, and the Germans, even from the onset of their campaign of Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union, they could not hold the logistical lines necessary to launch and project force out to the Russia. As you will find, one German soldier said that the largest roads in Russia are dirt roads, and the smallest hamlet, the smallest town in Germany has paved roads, whereas the large main highways in Russia were all dirt still, because at that time the Russians had not developed a highway system, and they had moved everything by rail. So the Soviets had this ring around Moscow of rail networks so they could project force outward from Moscow. They could bring material and men and shipments of armaments from the east, from beyond the Ural Mountains. They could bring them all across Russia, and they did. At one point, the heavy rail minister, Lazar Kaganovich, moved 400,000 soldiers in 1 week from Siberia to the Western Front, and the Russians knew this as a great patriotic war. It's a battle of men and real divisions of fighting men, armies, the core system, of course, taking place since Napoleon, but whole armies of men, 3.5 million men on each side, 3.5 million Germans, highly trained German soldiers, and 3.5 million highly trained Russian soldiers. The Russians were forward deployed, which gave them a disadvantage because the Germans penetrated their lines very rapidly and encircled them. And in the first few months, the first month of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans thought they were doing quite well because they had captured millions of Russian soldiers. And then they surrounded Kiev and captured even more. I believe 700,000 around Kiev. But they captured in total 2 to 4 million Russian soldiers in this first couple months of the invasion. But what we study here, we're studying the ideologies of the war as well as what their ideologies wrought in military terms. You will find, I believe that both the Third Reich, both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, were influenced. I know Stalin was, and I suspect that Hitler was influenced by the modern philosophy of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He was following the line of Hegelian dialectics and this idea of historical necessity, this idea of a higher form taking place. And both the communists and the fascists believed that they were the new men in history, you see. They believed that they were the new men in history. The old history had belonged to them, to their fruition, to their highest form, their highest fighting form. And as Hitler would have it in the Third Reich, this was an eternal struggle. For the Russians, it was no different. It was the same on both sides. The ideas were the same on both sides, and they copied each other. They borrowed from each other quite more than we realize today. What happened is that both of them argued for a centralized economy, centralized state-run economy. Both of them were about arming up with armaments of steel and heavy industry. Both of them were forms of modernity, you see. These are the three areas where they thought both National Socialism and communism was a revolution in their country. Both forms of National Socialism and communism in Russia, National Socialism in Germany was a revolution in that country. They were a form of modernity. They believed they had claim to the future and a progressive realization of the future. They believed they owned the future, that it'd be a 1,000-year Third Reich or world communism. And then finally, they were all of heavy industry. So there are three forms. Both the communists and the National Socialists believed they knew they were a revolution, they knew they were a form of modernity, and they knew that they were after heavy industry. Hitler's conquest of Russia would end with him extracting as much resources from minerals, steels, oil, fuel from Russia as is possible to extract from that country. That's what he foresaw. There was a sense in which he knew there would be an agrarian state in the captured Soviet Union. If the Germans had won, there would be an agrarian state, but he wanted to extract as much raw materials, oil, minerals, ores, to make heavy armaments, heavy machinery and heavy armaments. Stalin himself knew that he would push he knew that he would push communism across the continent of Europe. He planned on it. This was what their whole philosophy in the Soviet Union was built up around, was that they would push at the end of a bayonet, they would push forward communism into the world across Europe. They believed that if they couldn't foment revolutions in the West, they would push to it with armaments and force. They just didn't anticipate that the Germans would do so well in the Western Front and then turn on them in the East with such vibrant force and power and attack. So, both of them are influenced by Hegel. Both of them inherit the philosophy of modernity. They both all believe those three elements I mentioned. They were both revolutions in Germany and Russia, heavy industry, and they're both forms of modernity. And Stalin was literally called the Steel Man. He's literally went around calling himself, I'm the ruler of Russia and I'm the Steel Man. So he's going to mechanize and in heavy industry and what he said to these captains of heavy industry in Russia is he said the Soviet Union is 100 years behind the West in armaments and development, and it must make good in 10 years what the Western powers have done in 100 years. And it did happen over the 3 5-year plans that Stalin initiated from 1928 until 1941. The 3 5-year plans that were actually foreshortened to 4 years each time. But they were about arming the Soviet Union, and the Russians were brilliant at making stamped steel parts, so they could assemble vast machines of tanks. Their T-34 was one of the best tanks in the world at the time. It definitely superseded the German tanks, but they made stamped parts. Their weapons, their small arms, their artillery, their tanks was all made from heavy industry, and they perfected the craft. The Russians perfected the craft of manufacturing military machines for warfare. And they made stamp parts. The one thing they left out that the Germans had this when they invaded. The Germans' tank system, when they invaded the Soviets, they concentrated all their tanks into tank mechanized corps and mechanized divisions. And they gave each tank crew a radio so they could coordinate with each other. And you'd have 30 or 40 tanks moving with each other in the German lines, the German corps. With the Russians, they apportioned their tanks erroneously. They did this, and it's a horrible mistake. They put one tank with each infantry division as tank warfare they thought would develop in their time, because Stalin had executed the lead theorist for tank warfare in Russia, Tukhachevsky, I believe his name was. Tukhachevsky was executed by Stalin in the Great Purges. And so the Soviets were bereft of older officer class, because about 2/3 of the officer corps, 2/3 of the officers in the Soviet military were killed or imprisoned or exiled. And 3 of the 5 field marshals of the Soviet Union were killed. And of the Army General Staff, about 40 out of 50 generals were taken out. So it was just Stalin cleaned house. He didn't want a Napoleon Bonaparte to rise up and take over the Soviet state. He wanted to be head of the Soviet state. And so he instituted, not just wiped out the officer corps, but he also put commissaires in the military to watch over the officers that still remained. Because you have to have officers in the military, but Stalin said if they're ideologically pure, they'll be monitored by these commissaires, right? So you have it that they both ran for steel. In Germany, they were pitifully lacking in minerals and ores, steel ores, and in fuel. The Germans were bereft of much natural resources. If they had more natural resources, they probably could have done a lot better. The Soviets had the resources, but they had to learn how to harness them. And so it was a clash of titans, literally a clash of titans, where on June 22nd of 1941, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the Germans launched their attack, and the last trains crossed just 40 minutes before they launched their attack. The last trains exchanging goods back and forth across the border, as they had these compacts and these trade agreements to exchange minerals and machine parts back and forth. Machine parts coming from Germany into Russia, and Russia sending minerals and ores and fuel into Germany before the invasion. And then when the invasion took place, 3.5 million highly trained German soldiers, the Wehrmacht army, in 4 panzer armies. There was 4 panzer armies led by Hoth, Guderian, and Kleist. I forget the fourth one, but Hoth, Guderian, and Kleist. And Guderian was the one who engineered the move through the Ardennes in the west, so he was the lead tank theorist in the German army. You had the 3 German army groups, so four panzer army groups at the forefront as the pincers, as the tip of the spear for the Germans. And then you had 3 army groups: Army Group Center under von Bock, under Army Group North under von Lieb, and Army Group South under von Rundstedt. And these generals managed the invasion. And as the Germans would move in pincer movements, they would encircle pockets of huge amounts, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. But it still took the army, the infantry, marching sometimes 70 kilometers in a day, marching with their full gear. And they used a lot of horses to transport their goods too. Horses were still very used extensively in the Second World War. The pincers would move and they turn around and start moving back, but the infantry had to close the pockets and had to seal the pockets and capture and round up all the Soviets. So you have that's Operation Barbarossa. After Operation Barbarossa came the encirclement of Kiev, where Hitler encircled, I think it's between 1.7 or 700,000 Russian soldiers. Sorry, I'm forgetting the numbers here. It's at least 700,000, maybe even 1.2 or 1.4 or 1.7 million soldiers. But the Germans encircled. There was a big debate with the Germans: do we move on to Moscow or do we move to encircle the ones to the south? So that if they didn't encircle the ones in the south of Russia, if you're thinking about the Germans moving across Russia west to east, the 3 army groups of 4 panzer armies, you'll see that if they didn't capture the ones in the south, they could be, the ones in the middle could be, their supply lines could be cut off. So they really had to take over Russia in a whole chunk, as a whole, like a python devouring a large prey. So you have that, you have the ideologies, and so this is turning out to be a military history, but there's also an ideology is that, like I said, they're modernity, they're both forms of modernity, they're both heavy industry, and they're both revolutions, and they're both influenced by George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and then Karl Marx. I believe even Adolf Hitler was taught by Karl Marx. He studied Marxism, and he envied the revolutionary character of the Bolsheviks and the Communist Party. So this is a military history, but mixed with ideology, because these were what they were both. Stalin was a steel man, and Hitler was. He could have called himself a steel man because he did the same effect in Germany, correct? So you have the military conflict, but the ideologies are all about building up this higher synthesis, this new man to reign supreme. Like, I don't think Nietzsche influenced the Third Reich that much, but he predicted the Third Reich. He didn't influence the Third Reich, but he predicted the Third Reich. The Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman, the man that would rule over territory, that would rule over the domain of the surface of the earth, rule over domain of the surface of the earth. And the Germans, see, I think also the Germans and the Russians, we think of them as ideological dribble, but it wasn't. These were powerful thought systems and powerful ideologies that captured an afflatus, or a spirit that captured over the people. You see, it's out of huge scarcity, impoverishment, and practical necessity, and trying to break enslavement. They were trying to break enslavement because, you see, the Russians were always hungry, always the workers were not paid very well. Their country was in shambles under the czars. And so when the Soviets came along promising peace, land, and bread, the Russian people jumped at it. And so they seized power in Russia. And in Germany, likewise in Germany, Adolf Hitler, in the Weimar Germany, they had just been defeated catastrophically, lost 2 to 4 million German soldiers in World War I to death and injury and casualties. And the Germans were facing scarcity. They're hyperinflation. 1 million of them have starved to death, roughly 900,000 starved to death in World War I. They were struggling. They were enslaved. What you don't realize about the Treaty of Versailles? Here's what will blow your mind of the Treaty of Versailles. The Western powers demanded that Germany, I forget how much a Reichsmark is worth. It's not worth as much as a US dollar, especially at that time. But in 1919, 1920, the Western powers demanded that Germany give them 250 billion Reichsmarks. Whereas if you had liquidated all the capital stock and all the heavy industry, all the major corporations, all the heavy industry of Germany, and all the all the big companies in Germany, if you liquidated all their stock and all their capital, they would only be worth 15 billion Reichsmarks. So they're owing something on the order of a magnitude of 15 to 20 times more than what their whole industry or their whole economy is worth. If you liquidated their whole economy, even the small businesses and the corporations, all the Germans collectively, the capital stock, the stock and the value of the company, the physical material you could extract from Germany, it was only worth 15 billion Reichsmarks, but the Allies demanded 250 billion Reichsmarks from them. So something on 15 times to 20 times worth more what their physical stock was worth, what their physical capital was worth, and what the corporations were worth. And here's a further point, is that the German companies only paid 1 billion Reichsmarks in dividends per year, whereas the interest carried on the Versailles Treaty was 12 billion. So they were owing an order of magnitude of capital wealth, built up wealth. They owed 250 billion, they only had 15 billion. They owed 12 billion in interest payments, and they only made 1 billion Reichsmarks a year. 12 billion Reichsmarks interest payment, 1 billion Reichsmarks in dividends per year. So this is what we don't understand about Weimar Germany and about the Third Reich, is that the National Socialist was a response to enslavement to the West and dread forces of the communists pushing in from the East. As the communists, the Germans knew, and Hitler knew, that the Russians were starving their own people to death by the order of tens of millions, and they were stealing all the Bolsheviks were cannibalizing, not just causing cannibalism to happen in the countryside, but also cannibalizing all the wealth, all the Tsar's gold reserves, all the food, all the grain they're requisitioning to starve their peasants to death, to sell to the Western powers. So the Germans saw this enslavement to the Western powers on one end, and dread communism pushing in from the East from the other side. So this gives you an idea of the forces at play in Weimar Germany before Hitler rapturously took a theory of the democratic case of aplomb, that he captured the power democratically, and then by use of authoritarian force. So you have this, you have a build-up, it's a complete charnel house, it's a complete head-to-head clash of titans. And the Bolsheviks on their side, they also thought they were the newest form. They believed in world communism, but they believed in a vanguard of the party, the Bolshevik party, to make this revolution on behalf of the worker. But they were also true communists. We don't know this, but they were true communists. The National Socialists were true National Socialists. The communists were true communists. They didn't have God. And in any case, they didn't have God. Neither side had God. And they were, as we will know, both sides were the Antichrist kingdom at operation. But you have it said the Bolsheviks, being a highly metaphysical party, as the Bolsheviks were they were a philosophical party. Even Stalin published his pamphlet for the Soviet school system on historical necessity and dialectical materialism in 1938. He published this after the height of the purges to train the Soviet school system in the proper course of Soviet doctrine, a Bolshevik doctrine and communist doctrine, that you must be a true communist because you believe in dialectical materialism, which is basically materialism only with dialectics involved. And I'll explain that later. I'll explain that right now, actually. The Russians believed in dialectical materialism. So they believed that everything was the interpretation of opposites. It was two sides clashing and a higher synthesis taking form. It was a whole movement of a civilization and a culture, or a movement of a new form of man taking place in historical necessity, material crossing into material, newer forms taking place, and the newest form, the highest man, and the communists. And there's, much like the Ubermensch, only there's a communist version of this. And it's like, so it's dialectical materialism, two sides of material crashing, taking higher form, synthesizing, and a whole sweep of a broad movement through history of historical necessity. And these are what the Russians believed. And they believed in worldwide communism. They believed that they could sweep the whole world up in their movement, starting with revolution in one country, in Russia, but then pushing at the edge of their guns across the European continent to liberate what they saw liberating the workers. And there was 6 million Communist Party members, 6 million party members of the Communist Party in Germany in 1920. There had already been communist revolution uprising in Bavaria and the main national government in Weimar Germany. And so the Germans, the Bavarian Christian and the right-wing Bavarian Volkisch movements, the 70-some parties, that the National Socialists were only one party out of 70 parties in the both Volkisch right in Bavaria. But the Germans, the Germans in the countryside and in the towns had a strong, vehement anti-communism because it was a dread force. They were right about this, by the way. They were rightly convicted about the communists. So you have these ideologies, you have these powers taking place, and could go further, but I'll leave it there for now. The ideology that they are modernity, heavy industry, and revolutions in both countries. They were the new form, the higher synthesis. I believe Adolf Hitler stole from dialectical materialism. I believe he believed in dialectical materialism as well as the communists. So as both the communists and the Third Reich, both the USSR and the Third Reich, their metaphysical party, they're the National Socialists and the communists, the Bolsheviks, studying Hegel, studying Marx, studying the higher forms, studying the movement of history. They believe they were scientific as well. They both believe that they were scientific as well. So these are the ideologies, and then it led to the clash I discussed the first half of this talk, the clash of Titans, Operation Barbarossa, which really the Germans failed to take over Russia by December of 1941. They could not have advanced any further. The Soviets solidified a network of troops and armies around Moscow, and then it took 4 more years for them to push the Germans out of Eastern Europe. But the Germans, as Claude said, the culmination of attack is when the attackers meet the force of the defenders and they equal each other. The attackers equal the force of the defenders. So the Germans around October and November and then December of 1941 had petered out. Their logistics had failed. Their tanks had failed to capture Moscow. And so the Russians, being resupplied by the Allies, the British, and Americans, by the Lend-Lease program, could push back. And then Germans had to worry about a Western Front. With all this clash of titans, they both had Hegel and Marxism to lead as their ideology. I believe both the Third Reich, and I believe Hitler borrowed from dialectical materialism and this idea, and he also was a social Darwinist who believed in the eternal struggle of forces and races. So you have this, and the communists, of course, having the dialectical materialism and the historical necessity. With this, I'll leave you my peace. I give you in the name of Jesus Christ for the Holy Spirit. God bless you. Amen. Take care. Bye-bye.